Before we get started, I just wanted to set the framework for our discussion today. And should just introduce myself very briefly now. My name is Amania Zeldin, and I work for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is a part of Department of Homeland Security. And I'll go into a little bit more about what I do specifically when it's my turn. But just to get us started, I wanted to say that, we're here to talk about community policing, as you know from the title of the panel. But we hope to, or my colleagues will be talking about their experiences working with non-citizens or immigrant communities in their respective cities and towns. And they're going to highlight some of the challenges that they've faced, but then also talk about some of their experiences, their best practices in connecting with their communities. We'll be talking about cultural competence, which I think is a great term for us to take away today. And just sort of working on building strong relationships and trust within communities that are non-citizens. My piece will be talking a little bit more about some of the immigration tools that are available to you as you work with your communities. So before we get started, just wanted a show of hands. Unfortunately, we can't start taking comments yet. Not enough time to walk up to the mic. But how many of you are in jurisdictions where there are foreign nationals or other non-citizens? Show of hands. Everybody, right? That's all of America? Okay. And then do all of you have best practices that you may have to share with us at the end? Maybe? Yeah? Okay, so we'll try to solicit some information from you at the end. We want to keep this a little bit more interactive towards the end. And then finally, just for my purposes, has anyone out there heard of the T visa or the U visa or continued presence, which are immigration programs? Okay, so a few of you. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, and we can answer more questions as we go. But I guess to get started, we'll have Chief Schultz start us off with his experiences and his best practices.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Schultz. I'm Chief of Public Safety in Fort Morgan, Colorado. And I've been a chief for 22 years in 3 different cities, and been working with our communities throughout that time, obviously. But I have a unique situation in Fort Morgan. I've been there about a year, and a little bit of background on Fort Morgan. It's a city 80 miles east of Denver, eastern Colorado, city of about 13,000 people. And in the community is a large beef packing plant. And the beef packing plant processes about 10,000 cattle a day. And they traditionally have had a difficult time getting people to work there from the immediate local area, even though they are truly an excellent employer. So what they have done is they have actually recruited employees from around the world, and specifically from numerous East African countries. And the largest number of recruits, employees are coming from Somalia. So this beef packing plant employs about 2,600 people and a very large Somalian population. And how this works is the company will recruit employees from a foreign country, bring them over, pay for their transportation, put them up in a motel for a month, and also provide a ability for them to get groceries and transportation. And of course, the employee has to pay back the company over a period of time out of their paycheck. And these folks are often bringing their families with them. So on the streets of Fort Morgan, it is very common to see, especially women, in traditional African dress. And it is made for quite an interesting situation. We were trying to work with this group, and I've only been there, like I said, less than a year, and I've taken this on as my mission because I think it's the right thing to do, and I think it's something that can be done. The history of this prior to me arriving is really fairly good, no problems per se, but this group of folks, which now number several thousand, are not, in my opinion, acclimating very well. So there'll be city events and they don't attend. There'll be events that they have and other members of the community don't attend. So we're trying to work with this group. We have applied for a federal grant to get a police officer assigned to work with this community virtually full-time. We hold several events every year that we invite this group specifically to come to, and we're getting, I would say, minimal participation. I think the future in our community as far as assimilating with this group really lies with the children, and that they are going to be assimilating very well. Our school district is about 59% non-white, with a majority of kids coming from these African countries. 27 different languages are spoken in our school district, which is really amazing when you think about that for a town in eastern Colorado. I would very much like to hire a Somalian police officer. We've not been able to do that yet, again, because of some of the issues that I mentioned. But I think over time we're going to be able to accomplish that. We have attended several religious events, different things associated with Ramadan, the Eid celebration after Ramadan, and that has been exceptionally well received by the Somalian community. We've also have, as virtually every town does, a large community event throughout the summer, one particularly large one, but usually 2 or 3 a month. And sorry to report, sad to report, that we don't have any attendees, any people attending our events from the Somalian community. So we have worked with some of the religious leaders, and we think we're making progress. I was hoping that in the next year, 2 years, that we have another panel like this, because I want to report back to you our progress. And I think we're starting to make significant progress in that regard. We do meet with the community elders, if you will, on a regular basis. We have worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Colorado protecting houses of worship. There's a mosque in our community. We have officers that go there quite frequently and very well received. There's no problems with these various groups in our community, none whatsoever. But there is this separation, and that's what we're trying to work on. So at the end of the presentation, if anybody has ideas they care to share, I would love to hear that, how we can work within this community better. We did have one young man who was interested, we were told, in being a police officer, and we immediately outreached to him, brought him in, and it turns out it was a tragic case of miscommunication. He wanted to be a doctor and not a police officer, but did want to volunteer in the police department for the summer, so that was kind of exciting. So that's our situation, and it's relatively unique again in Colorado, all as a result of this large beef packing plant. The recruiting of these employees, as I mentioned, from several East African countries, Somalia being the prominent one, but not strictly Somalia, several different countries, and some of the folks that are coming to work there don't necessarily get along with the people from Somalia. So it's some issues within the group that we're also trying to work with. Right now, due to the travel ban, this company is recruiting people from Puerto Rico. And we probably go down to the factory, to this large plant, at least once a month for what's called an onboarding session, where all representatives from the city, different departments in city government, including police, we meet with the new employees. There's always a translator there, and explain the new ordinances that they are going to encounter and how the city works, and welcome them to participate. So we're doing a series of things. We're hoping for good outcomes. Again, I mentioned earlier that we hope you do this again in a year or so we can report back. But that's our experience right now. I'll pass this on.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Partee. I'm a major with the Baltimore Police Department. I'm a visiting fellow with the IACP for a 1-year stint. So I was asked to be on the panel because of my time as a district commander in Baltimore. The district that I supervised, or I was in charge of, was a very fluid district, and it had suffered from issues with institutional racism in terms of housing. So the district was separated by one main thoroughfare, which is Northern Parkway, and African Americans did not venture across Northern Parkway. There was an established Orthodox Jewish community on the other side of Northern Parkway, and the African American community knew not to venture across that thoroughfare because there would be some sort of issues. So what we had to do was, once I took over, I had to figure out how to connect with these different communities and do community policing and not have a different perspective and a different approach to each one. So what I did was, myself and my team came up with 3 C's. And the first of the 3 C's is credibility. So there's always an issue with credibility in communities because there's always that us versus them mentality when it comes to policing in the community. And the way that we bridged that gap was we made sure that we had officers that knew the community, that already had some sort of credibility in the community. That way we had a foothold to push a little bit forward in that community. For example, in the Orthodox Jewish community, we had an officer who was an Orthodox Jew at one point, and he would bring us in to the meetings and actually explain the customs and the things that we needed to know in order to move forward in the community. I myself grew up in the community below Northern Parkway, so that credibility already existed with me, and I already had a foothold with the community on that aspect. There was also a large Hispanic community that started to grow in that it's called Upper Park Heights and Lower Park Heights. In the Upper Park Heights community above Northern Parkway, where the Orthodox Jewish community was. So we brought in Spanish-speaking officers to help us to kind of start that relationship in that community. So that first C is credibility. And then you move to the next C, which is competence. And we talked earlier, just mentioned about cultural competency. You'll hear a lot of catchphrases when it comes to this, and you'll hear a lot of people talk about diversity. Diversity is great, but diversity is only the first step. Once you get a diverse population in your police department, you need to make sure that that diverse population is culturally competent with the people that they serve. So we had to build that cultural competency, and we did that through the officers that brought us that credibility. We had training sessions. We made sure that officers, even the officers that didn't speak Spanish, had that survival Spanish so that they knew what to say, how to say it, how to give commands in Spanish, how to have some sort of conversation with the individuals in Spanish. And then with the Orthodox Jewish community, they needed to know the customs in terms of the days that are Sabbath days, when they walk, and all of the things that came about with that. With the African American community, they needed to understand certain ways, certain customs, and things that were said, certain terminologies that went on. So that's how we built that. So it's the first C is credibility, the second C is competence, and the third C is connection. And that's built through the first 2 C's. So that connection and that confidence, I use those interchangeably. The community, once they get connected with your police department, then they build that confidence in your police department. And community policing is that much easier because everybody's on the same page. There's no miscommunication. There's no one entity is going one way and the other entity is going the other way. Everybody understands where everybody's going. You build that relationship and you move forward. So that's how we approached the different communities in terms of pushing that community policing agenda forward.
One of the things that we're trying to work with is in our community, the Somalian people have a couple of restaurants, and we have been invited to go there, but we have been asked not to go to the restaurants in uniform, which is kind of interesting. And I inquired about that. I said, well, why wouldn't you want a police officer in your restaurant in uniform? And the reason is that in Somalia, if a police officer is there, according to our residents, that they would think that the other people would think that the owners of the restaurant are informants for the police. So that's kind of a starting point where we're working with. And of course, we assured them that, well, that's not our situation here. So we've been able to broach that. It took several months, but we now have officers attending or going to those restaurants in uniform. But that was the stumbling block. You can see our starting point is really towards the beginning, but we are dedicated to making this work. Again, with the kids in the community, especially when they get to school age, that seems to disappear. We have very good relationships with the kids, but we're trying to work with the parents and grandparents, new arrivals, things of this nature. And it's a challenge, that's for sure, but I'm very confident we're going to get there.
Great.
Thanks. It's actually a really good segue into the beginning of what I can talk about, this reluctance of having a police presence and what that means. And I guess I'd venture to say, there are particular challenges that foreign nationals or non-citizens have in working with law enforcement. And one is sort of, what does law enforcement look like in the country that they're coming from? In many places, police are not to be trusted, they're corrupt, or it's part of a system that most people are not, don't take part in. And so that obviously forms a pretty big challenge for having people come forward to both report crime and then participate in the investigation of it. Any other, before I sort of take over, do either one of you want to chime in with some of the other very specific challenges that you have seen in your communities with people coming forward?
One of our challenges is with the Somalis as drivers. They're not the best drivers on the road, and we've had several car accidents with Somalis, and we offer them remedial training and things of this nature. And there's always a little bit of an angst, is our opinion, when we have a police officer stop a Somali. From the Somalis' point of view, several of them are quite concerned about, well, we're being stopped by the police, what's going to happen? And of course we explain to them, well, nothing's going to happen. The most that's going to happen is a ticket, generally a warning. But we think we have been able to cross that barrier of any concerns, but we still run across that sometimes. We have some people that we stopped that seem to be very, very nervous that they're being stopped by the police for a traffic violation. But we have had several accidents where people have a hard time adjusting to driving. But we have a remediation program for that.
So the issue that we were dealing with was with our Hispanic population and not reporting being robbed. We have a anchor store that was built in the district, a Home Depot, and you had a lot of undocumented people that were working, were being picked up in the morning and dropped off in the afternoon, and we had a band of evildoers that were robbing those individuals because they were being paid in cash. And because of their relationship or what they perceived as a bad relationship with law enforcement, they didn't want to report these things. So what we did was we staked out up there. When they came back, we were there. We showed them that we were there to protect them. They lived in some apartments that were right behind the shopping plaza where the Home Depot was, and we made sure that they got from the Home Depot to their apartments without being accosted. And they started talking to us and telling us who the individuals were, and come to find out it was a group of teenagers that actually lived in those same apartments. And when we started enforcing and putting cases together on those individuals, we ended up clearing a lot more robberies, not just with the Hispanic population, but also with our Orthodox Jewish population, with our elderly African American population that lived in the area. And I saw a dramatic drop in my robberies, and also with my larceny from autos, because these same kids were the ones that were doing all of the crime in my area. So it paid off. It paid dividends in the end that we reached out to that population and gained a little bit of their trust. They still don't know how to take us, especially with what's going on these days. But that helped me out a lot, and it kept me from getting beat up at Comstat, if you guys know what Comstat is.
Okay, so I promise it's not death by PowerPoint, but I am going to put a PowerPoint up, just because it's easier for our discussion, I think. And I hope this works. Let's see. It does. Okay. So, we're talking about some of these very specific challenges, and I think Major Party really brought up something very interesting, that there are foreign nationals who are victims of crime in our community, and they don't report it. And that's a pretty serious issue, because we don't want crimes to affect anybody. And then it turns out that it wasn't just affecting this one immigrant group, it was affecting the larger community. And so it's in everyone's interest, of course, that victims come forward to report crime and then participate in the investigation of the crime. So I'll talk a little bit about some of these very specific immigration programs available to victims of certain types of crime. Again, my name is Amanda Zeldin, and I'm with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Just very quickly, there are, Department of Homeland Security was created and stood up actually in 2003. And within the Department of Homeland Security, there are certain immigration related agencies. There's ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and that's the enforcement arm that you all may be more familiar with. I'm with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is, again, just the government agency that oversees lawful immigration to the United States. So we're the agency that people submit applications and petitions to obtain lawful immigration status, whether that's based on a family relationship or an employer applying for an employee. And then there are some other types of immigration, ways to gain immigration status that we don't need to go into. So I asked this question already at the beginning, whether anyone's been involved in supporting a foreign victim in obtaining one of these immigration programs. And there were a couple of you who answered yes about the T non-immigrant status or U non-immigrant status or continued presence, which is what I'll talk about. And then there's some other humanitarian-based programs that if you want to hear more about it after, please come see me. Also, just so you know, this PowerPoint is available, a little bit of a longer version in the materials that we uploaded to this panel, so you will have it there, as well as some other resources that we'll make sure to point out at the end of our conversation. So we talked a little bit about this, that foreign crime victims face pretty significant barriers to coming forward and reporting crime. They fear law enforcement, they're reluctant to engage with law enforcement. They fear, not just because law enforcement may not be trustworthy in their home countries, but they may also just have fears about what it means for their own status. Maybe they're here undocumented or without lawful status, and so they're worried that that means they'll be removed or deported from the United States. Or maybe certain family members of theirs don't have status, and they're worried about how police involvement will affect them. There's, of course, language barriers, cultural barriers, all these things that sort of come together to make it really difficult for these individuals to come forward, even when they are victims. And so Congress created certain immigration benefits to really try to address these issues, knowing that, of course, we want victims to come forward. That's sort of best for all of us. So Congress created the T and U visa. There was a two-part reason for creating them. One is it's a really important and valuable tool for law enforcement to be able to have victims who will come forward and cooperate. But it also, the other reason that these programs were created were to provide humanitarian relief for victims of crime. If you don't have lawful immigration status, it makes it very difficult to rehabilitate, makes it difficult to get services, makes it difficult to make sure you stay in school or go to work, or to ensure that your kids are able to do that. So it's sort of this dual benefit of these immigration programs. And they really do sort of encourage where law enforcement knows about these programs and uses them. It does encourage people to come forward, and it helps build this community trust that we sort of talked about at the beginning of today. So both the T and U visa, just so you know, they're an immigration status that, if approved, the person gets this lawful status for 4 years. They get a work permit, and certain family members are able to be included to get a T or U visa. And I'll talk about the eligibility for those in a second, just so you get a sense of who may actually qualify. T visas, Congress created caps, so we can only give 5,000 T visas per year. A T visa is for a victim of a severe form of human trafficking. And then the U visa was created, we can only give out 10,000 of these per year, and that's for victims of certain serious crimes, and I'll show you the list of crimes in a couple slides. You may be wondering why T is for trafficking and U is for crimes. That's just sort of the alphabet soup. Immigration assigns visas just down the alphabet. We were on T and U. It happened to work for trafficking. But for example, a student visa is an F visa. So there's no rhyme or reason, in case you're wondering. So let's talk about the T visa really quickly. And again, I don't want to death by PowerPoint you, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly so we can get back to our discussion. So T visa is for a victim of a severe form of trafficking in persons. They have to meet the federal definition of being a victim of a severe form of trafficking in persons. There's no unsevere form of trafficking. It's just the term that Congress used to create this definition, this term. So if you're a victim of trafficking and severe, we're not assessing the severity of it. The person has to be in the United States on account of that trafficking. So it's not just for trafficking victims worldwide. It's someone that's in the U.S. because the trafficking either occurred here or they're here because they're assisting law enforcement in some sort of trafficking investigation or prosecution. The victim has to comply with reasonable requests to cooperate in the investigation or prosecution of the crime. And then finally, they have to show that if they're removed from the United States, it would cause extreme hardship. So pretty basic. Of course, meeting these requirements can be difficult. These are sort of the basic T visa requirements. And where sort of law enforcement comes in, of course, is that this element of showing requests to comply with reasonable requests for assistance. So that's the T visa. U visa, real quick, for victims of other serious crimes. The victim has to be a victim of a qualifying criminal activity. On the next slide, you'll see this list of pretty terrible crimes that they have to be a victim of. The crime has to have occurred here in the United States or violated U.S. law. The victim has to have credible and reliable information about it, the crime. The victim has to show that they have been in the past, are currently being or likely to be helpful in the investigation or prosecution of that crime. And then finally, the victim has to show that they suffered substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of that qualifying crime. So the elements are a little bit different for the U visa, and we'll talk a little bit more about the differences in a second. But I just wanted to show you the list of crimes that may qualify someone for a U visa. As you see, they're not necessarily all violent crimes, but they're serious. The ones that we see most often are domestic violence. By a large percentage, domestic violence is pretty high. Felonious assault is also pretty high. Murder, rape and sexual assault, those are very high as well. Yeah, those are sort of the unfortunate big ones. And so if a person is a victim of one of those crimes, cooperates with law enforcement, and law enforcement certifies that they have been cooperative, they may be eligible for a U visa. You may be looking at this list and think, well, if you're a victim of murder, why do you need a visa? You don't. But if you are a victim of attempted murder or conspiracy or solicitation, you potentially are eligible for a U visa. There's also something available for indirect victims of crime, and I'll take a second to talk about this because if you have someone approaching you requesting a certification for one of these, you may encounter this situation. So for example, you'll see up there sexual assault or rape. You may have a child victim of sexual assault who is a U.S. citizen, so they don't need a U visa. But their parent may be undocumented, and they were the ones who reported the crime, who facilitate bringing their child to those forensic interviews so that they can conduct the investigation. And they're very much a part of the process. So they potentially could be eligible as an indirect victim of that crime. There's, under the federal criminal code, there indirect victims, there's a way to be eligible. So if they can show that and they otherwise meet those requirements, crime occurred in the United States, they have credible and reliable information about it, they cooperated, and I'm certain that a parent could show that they suffered substantial mental abuse as a result of their child being direct victim of that crime. We also see a lot of cases where in this indirect victim context. So, the quick note about your role as law enforcement officials. So there are these applications for a T and a U visa are something that the victim or the attorney would submit to our agency. But along with their application packet, they would include this form I-918 Supplement B for the U visa. It's an actual, it's a requirement for their application. And that's the certification for law enforcement that basically indicates that this person is the victim of the crime, that they were cooperative, and sort of outlines anything else that you all think would be important for us to know. And then the I-914 Supplement B is the form that's for the T visa application. That one's actually not mandatory for the trafficking case. The person still has to show that they're cooperative, but they don't actually need that law enforcement form, although of course it's very helpful for us. But in the U visa, it's an absolute requirement, and that's where your role comes in, to fill out this form and give it to them so they can submit it with their application to us. Just a couple tips about these forms. Maybe we don't need to go into that so much, but this tip sheet is in the PowerPoint in your packets at the end. Yeah, tips for completing. And then I just wanted to briefly talk about continued presence. This is a program also created by Congress at the same time that the T and the U visa were created. And I leave it at the end because it's a program that's actually administered by our partner agency, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And it's a program that's available to victims of human trafficking. So it's very specific just for trafficking victims. And it offers immediate protection from removal from the United States and a work permit. And it's a very temporary status. It's available in 2-year increments, and it's not even a status. It's just basically deferred action. So the government is, at this point, if they don't have any serious issues in their background, they're not going to remove them from the United States so that they can be available to you in your investigation or prosecution. Someone with continued presence may potentially be eligible for a T visa or U visa, and that's a longer-term immigration status that they would work through with their immigration attorney. But just so you know, continued presence is actually something that has to come through a federal law enforcement agency. So the federal law enforcement agency can request this continued presence from ICE directly. So if you're not federal law enforcement and you think you have a victim of trafficking, that needs to be connected with this so that they have a work permit and some sort of stability so they can work with you in your investigation or prosecution, you would connect with a federal law enforcement agency, the FBI or ICE directly or DEA, and then they would help facilitate getting this really temporary short-term deferred action basically so that the person can be in the country as you need them. So just a couple important law enforcement notes that I think may answer some questions, but it can certainly take more at the end. So all applicants for continued presence and T visas and U visas are fingerprinted as a part of our process of vetting them for eligibility for this immigration status. So if they have serious criminal history or serious immigration violations, they either have to request a waiver to show why we should go ahead and waive these criminal violations and allow them to be here, or we would deny their application. So the severity of their criminal history will affect whether or not they're ultimately given this status in the United States. Just something important to note. And that's sort of what that second bullet is about, that these grounds of inadmissibility is an immigration legal term of art, that there are certain grounds that would make someone inadmissible to the United States so that they wouldn't ultimately be able to get status or a green card. USCIS, my agency, has fraud protection mechanisms in place to make sure that we are issuing the appropriate status to the appropriate person at the right time. We take our fraud investigations very seriously. If you are a law enforcement agency and you certify that someone was helpful to you in your investigation or prosecution, you're not liable for any future actions that person may commit. So sometimes that can be a question you have, but you're not liable. And then finally, law enforcement can and should update our agency with any developments if the person who at once was cooperative stopped being cooperative. The cooperation requirement is ongoing in these programs, so we'd like to hear from law enforcement if there are any changes in this person's cooperation, because these Again, there's two reasons for these visas. One is for that humanitarian benefit that's really important to victims of crime, but the other is that they do cooperate with law enforcement. So this is just a quick chart to compare the programs I talked about. Beau, we didn't talk about today. It's another immigration program. We can talk about it offline if you like. But you'll see continued presence, T visa, and the U visa are up there. Continued presence in the T visa are for victims of human trafficking. The U visa is for people who are victims of that sort of larger 26 crime list that I showed you. The federal agency applies directly for continued presence, whereas for the T and the U visa, the victim applies directly with our agency. If approved, continued presence gives a person protection from a removal. That should actually say 2 years, not 1 year. That changed fairly recently, and a work permit. And then the T and U visa, if they're approved, they get actual immigration status, valid for 4 years with a 4-year work permit. And then the eligibility potentially to apply for a green card. There's no such path for continued presence. And then law enforcement agency support is required for continued presence. For the T visa, it's not required, but it's helpful in the form of Form I-914 Supplement B. And then in the U visa, it's an absolute requirement using that Form I-918 Supplement B. So also in the PowerPoint that you can download is some important contact information. There's law enforcement email boxes and phone numbers that you can contact if you have questions. I would say the email box that I personally check is to request law enforcement training, which is T_U_BAWA training at uscis.dhs.gov. Feel free to contact that if you have questions after today's session. If you do have colleagues that want training, we do webinars frequently because not everyone can always travel. I have some business cards with my actual unique email address on it, but I'm the only one that checks that box, so you can also just contact me there. And then information about how to contact ICE. And some resources. And what time is it? We're good. Okay, so finally for me, so also within the documents that we downloaded to the panel presentation, there is this U and T visa law enforcement resource guide that was created and published by Department of Homeland Security. It gives a much more detailed overview of these programs that I talked about. And at the end, there's some questions and answers that I think are really helpful to sort of help you if you have questions about these programs and how to maybe address them or apply them in your communities. I also put in a U visa 2-pager that's quick and dirty U visa. I have a feeling that more people are both familiar with U visa and use it more often and have need for it more often. So that information is in there. And then we also just have some websites with valuable information about our other programs. So that's the PowerPoint for me. I thought maybe I'd ask Chief Schultz to talk about the resources that you included, and then we'll just open it up and get some of your experiences and questions.
We've provided 2 handouts here. One is examples of police building trust with the East African community. It's a compilation of articles from around the United States, different cities, different approaches that we have given to all of our officers as part of in-service training. And the other one is an article from Police Chief Magazine that deals with the visas that were just described.
Okay, so we can take some questions or hear about some of your unique experiences. So I would have to ask just to go to the microphone in the center because they won't be able to pick it up on the recording.
When it comes to sponsoring an immigrant, I think that's the I-684 form. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, who turns that form in, the sponsor or the immigrant?
So the I-864, when you're going through like a family-based immigration process, it should be that the sponsor gives it to the named, it's called petitioner.
Okay.
And they submit it with their application directly to our agency.
Okay, does your agency follow up with the sponsor to confirm that the sponsor is in fact the sponsor?
We do vet those to make sure that they're a real person and should be, they don't have to have like a familiar relationship with them.
But are you going to reach out to the sponsor?
Not usually, but we can talk more offline about that if you want a little bit more specifics on that. We don't usually reach out directly to that person. We go on the documents that are submitted. with
Okay,
the
I'll come up
application.
after, because
Yeah.
I had a situation where I was victimized.
Oh.
You know, and the form isn't notarized either.
No,
A
it's
form
not.
that is, the sponsor is then financially responsible.
Mhm.
So you're signing a sponsorship form to be financially responsible for an individual, and it's not even notarized.
Mhm.
I think it should be, but I'll come up and talk to you.
Yeah, we can talk after. Thank you.
I observed in your list of crimes for the U visa, there was trafficking. Under what circumstances would someone apply for a U visa versus the T visa, which is a trafficking-related crime?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. I usually explain that. So for a person to qualify for a T visa, they have to meet the federal definition of being a victim of a severe form of human trafficking. But there are other trafficking statutes within each state may have a trafficking statute. So if they meet the definition of being a victim of trafficking in that jurisdiction, then they could potentially apply for a U visa rather than a T visa because they may not meet the federal definition. So that's an example of that.
I'd like to thank the panel and especially the two gentlemen for your openness and transparency on the struggles that you're having. I'm from California, and I've 20 years experience working with immigrant communities on a range of issues. My question is, your experience this year in the changed environment nationally, and what impact that has on your communities, and how you try to take that into account in reassuring immigrant communities. And I don't have to go through the litany. Of course, there's the actions against sanctuary cities, which I know both Philadelphia and Baltimore included, and of course the no more immigrants. What's that called? The ban, the travel ban. Interested in your thoughts.
That's a good question. I've attended several community forums, and that is the primary question I get asked. And when they boil that down specifically, will I assist ICE? If they come to our community to round up people, their terms, not mine, what is going to be our level of participation? And I make it very clear that we will not participate in those activities. We are not going to designate our officers as 287G. That's another question I get asked quite a bit. Are we going to deputize our officers to enforce immigration law? And I tell them, no, we're not going to do that. And I make it very clear I cannot stop ICE from coming to our community and enforcing federal law, but we will not assist them, other than if they are in need of some type of assistance regarding their safety. But the other question I get asked, are we going to supply information to ICE? And I tell them no, not without a federal subpoena. So that is a hot topic and it comes up all the time. Thank you.
So in Baltimore, and I think the chief's position is totally different from mine because I was a district commander and I was able to just focus on the crime that was there instead of having to worry about that other layer of what was going on. So in terms of what my police commissioner is doing, he's had his talks with those. Basically, it's above my pay grade. So yeah, I deal with the crime and I let the police commissioner deal with things on that end.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the panel's comments. I am with ICE. I am the Deputy Director for ICE Enforcement Removal Operations, and my name is Philip Miller. Although we weren't on the panel, just want to share a couple thoughts with you. Police manager to police manager, right? I'm a careerist. I've served under 4 presidents. Every president has asked me as an immigration officer to do something different, and that's true for all of us. First, Chief, as an Eagle Scout, I would suggest tapping into that power of the youth, maybe with an Explorer post. HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, has several Explorer posts. U.S. Border Patrol has several Explorer posts. It both helps to clarify what our mission is actually in the community, and it also gets people thinking, like, you know, is there a possibility for a career in service? You know, career in service can mean a lot of different things. You know, I was in the Army before I was an immigration officer, but you know, that idea kind of was embedded with me as a Boy Scout. In terms of you know, engaging with the community, that is something that I've had to do my entire career. Several different jobs. You know, being an immigration officer takes on a lot of different shapes. With the new agency, that has been limited, but as an immigration inspector and as a special emphasis program manager, I was very engaged with the Asian and Pacific Islander community throughout the Gulf Coast. Meeting with the elders was remarkably helpful in doing that, especially with the Vietnamese community. Without gaining the trust of their community leaders and their faith leaders, you will never develop that trust, much like you did, sir, Major, with the Orthodox Jewish community. In terms of what ICE has to offer, although we weren't asked to be on this panel, our community relations officers, who are actually not officers, but our former director, Sarah Saldana, chose that as their title, even though they are not LEOs. But they are a resource to engage with these communities. Because they're not LEOs, a lot of them actually came from the advocacy community, came from different police departments to work at the federal level. But that can somebody who can help you carry the message in your communities of what, first of all, what resources are available, because that's an important question, and then also can help to myth bust, right? I mean, the advocates in your community will tell you that if no one's reporting crime because they know you're going to turn that information over to ICE. Well, all of you know as police managers, how are fingerprints transmitted? Fingerprints are transmitted as a booking packet. Most communities, that's done by the sheriff's department, not the police department. But when we know somebody is in the county jail, it's because they've been booked in on a crime. It has nothing to do with the victims reporting crimes. It has nothing to do with your detectives conducting investigations and talking to people. And that's something that often is lost, that no one's actually clarifying the record, that even if you're a police department, larger police departments, Philly does it because Philly has its own jail, but in sending those booking packets, you're talking about people who have actually been arrested or suspected of a crime so severe that they weren't cited and released, they weren't given a ticket. Under your state's law, there was a reason that your officer brought them to the jail to pursue a charge that often starts off as a felonious offense, right? It may be pled down to a misdemeanor, depending on how your state works with its criminal code. But that action, that affirmative action by your officer, was taken in an effort to protect the community which he or she is policing. And we want to be part of that solution. You know, we talked a little bit about deferred action as a program to help you with your witnesses, to help you manage your investigations. That's something that has always existed. There's a lot of political rhetoric about one specific program and kind of a global application of deferred action, but deferred action has always been a tool that's available to work with our partners. So the idea that, you know, all of you, of course, we all have a boss, right? There's always an executive, whether it's a mayor or a city council, and you have to be responsive to what those folks are telling you, just like I have to be responsible to what the president and secretary tells me. But just know that, you know, cop to cop, police manager to police manager, we know that what the struggles are because we're going through those as well every day. And so don't think that you can't talk to your field office director. Don't think that you can't talk to your special agent in charge with ICE and see, you know, what can we do to help you get the true message out to the communities that your officers have to police every day. So it's kind of odd to say, you know, turn to ICE for help in talking to immigrant communities. But I mean, you know, in terms of managing our 39,000 people in detention today, we're dealing with people from about 190 different countries around the world, being culturally sensitive, religiously responsive, and understanding that mores and norms is something that we have to do as a matter of survival to do our job. So we want to know that all of you to know that we are a resource. Our community relations officers are a resource, and we can help be clear, cop to cop, on what's available, and hopefully we can kind of work political rhetoric aside. Thank you.
I might bring a bit of outside of America perspective. I work in the Irish Embassy in Washington, D.C., and I'm just interested to hear about Fort Morgan and the Somali immigrants that you have. In Ireland, I think in 2001, about 3% of our population were minority. We have about 13% now. But what we did to integrate that population was basically through the police force in the first place. We've one police force in Ireland, so we've one commissioner and we've divisions. So it's completely different to how things are run here in the States. But we set up a Garda racial diversity office. We have ethnic liaison officers, and we have events on an annual basis basically to encourage participation and constantly launching strategies to include the communities. But there's a network of police officers out there engaging with these communities. We all know that if you leave these communities alone, what's going to happen is you're going to have what happened in Paris, for example, where disaffected people have nothing to live for, and it encourages crime and terrorism. So there's a good example there if you want to look at the Irish model in terms of how to integrate communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have about 3 minutes left. Any other questions or best practices? Thank you for sharing that. Any final thoughts from you all?
I appreciate the comments, I really do. These are all ideas we'll take back, try to make our situation better. Again, I'm hoping we do this again in a year or so I can report back.
Okay. Well, thank you all. If you have questions for us individually, I'll be around for a little bit. Thank you.